Okay, so the paper I'll be giving today addresses a common conception that Buddhism is a religion of the middle way. This word is used a lot in scholarship, but it's also used in popular descriptions of Buddhism. By middle way, what I mean is a religion that is compatible with daily life. A religion of the middle way does not demand of the person that they change their life. At least this is the common conception. In fact, religions of the middle way are commonly thought to exist specifically to help a person achieve their personal goals in life. It's not a hindrance to the activities of the daily life. But what I wish to argue here is that the idea of meditation to improve your business skills, of Zen products to make your life easier, of the idea of chanting in order to calm yourself so you can focus better on your daily tasks, that Buddhism, in fact, early Indian Buddhism, in fact, runs against these tendencies, these modern conceptions that we have. So what I would argue instead is that Buddhism is actually a religion of extremes, a religion of asceticism, actually, not of the middle way. And what I mean by asceticism here is resistance, refusal, rejection of that which you actually desire the most. What you hope to accomplish in life, what you most want for yourself, what you most want for your loved ones, that is actually a rejection of those desires. Those attachments are considered to be fundamentally problematic from the ascetic perspective. Asceticism means not only refusing to achieve these personal goals or dreams, it means using all your mental energy to eradicate these goals from your mind. In this paper, I'll be focusing on a very specific set of evidence to make my point that Buddhism is not a religion of the middle way, especially Indian Buddhism, early Indian Buddhism, but that it is a religion of extremes, a religion of asceticism. I'll be focusing on a very specific set of texts, not so-called sutra literature, but the law codes for the early Indian Buddhist monks. These codes are about 2,000 years old, and they vary quite differently. They vary quite a lot from conceptions of legal codes that we might often have today. For example, take a document like the Constitution, which simply says you may do this, you should not do that. These legal codes have at their base stories or narratives, and the you should do this or you should not do this is actually really quite peripheral. We'll be looking at these stories about early Indian Buddhist monks in order to argue that Buddhism was not a religion of the middle way, but a religion of asceticism. So let's see here. So the codes I'll be looking at are known as the Vinaya. These were compiled between the beginning of the Common Era and the 5th century CE, so quite ancient. The map that you see here features the world of the Himalayan foothills, most frequently alluded to, the world alluded to in the Vinaya narratives. And during the course of my talk today, I hope you take away 2 basic points. The first is that ascetic practices were central to the life of early Indian Buddhist monks. In general, scholars in my field have accepted that while other religions in ancient India may have practiced asceticism, the Buddhists embraced a middle way, rejecting both the extremes of pleasure-seeking but also the rigors of asceticism. While most scholars suggest that ascetic practice was marginal or non-existent in the early monastery, I will demonstrate that asceticism was commonly practiced by monks in the Vinaya or legal codes. Second, I want to show that documents like the Vinaya, which are often regarded as normative, can be utilized to develop what I call a literary anthropology. When I say normative, I mean documents that are like the Constitution. There's no content, but they simply give a list of rules. You should do this, you may not do that. What I'd like to show is that there's something called a literary anthropology that you can do of the Vinaya codes. This literary anthropology means something like looking for the daily life activities of these individual monks utilizing the narratives within the codes. Now, normative texts are usually thought of as presenting only rules for behavior and not as providing thick descriptions of social realities associated with anthropology. The legal case narratives in the Vinaya are not the kind of classic archival materials employed by historians, as they often have no known author. They're not linked to any particular geographic locale in ancient India and were compiled over many centuries. In other words, it's very, very hard to pin them down sociologically. And while I agree with many scholars that the Vinaya narrative should be categorized as a kind of literary work and not a kind of classic historical archival source, the stories that I'm going to talk about do attest the consistency of many practices, many rituals, and social mores which can be ascribed to large swaths of ancient Indian society, including the Buddhist monastery itself. This interpretive approach of literary anthropology is largely inspired by feminist theoreticians and those scholars who have set themselves what I think is an admirable goal of writing anthropologies which aim to recover the lived experiences of people in ancient South Asia, using this rich documentation preserved in these sources. In what follows below, I hope to draw upon this rich hermeneutical tradition of reading against the grain of normative sources in order to articulate a literary anthropology of early Indian Buddhist monasticism. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'll focus on the practice of Pindapata, one of the classic ascetic Buddhist practices, or Duttagunas. There are 3 grades of difficulty to this practice, but the strictest or most ascetic interpretation prohibits the monk from receiving any food from donors at all unless they are providing him a meal at the gate of their house. He goes out every morning from the monastery for 1 meal a day. He arrives at the door of a particular house, and he has to wait for the householder to respond. If he gets nothing there, he moves on until he's fed. If nobody feeds him, he doesn't eat. This is the strictest version. Classics of Indian Buddhist asceticism, such as the Visuddhimagga, regard the acquisition of one's daily fare as an ascetic practice when there's an indeterminacy to it. From whom will I get my food? When will I get my food? How far will I have to travel? Will the food be fresh or rotten? The greater the level of indeterminacy, the less you know about how it's going to happen, the more ascetic the practice. Now, scholars in the field of Indian Buddhism and Buddhist studies more generally have tended to view these practitioners of Pindapata, or begging for one's food, as outliers, freaks even, not part of the mainstream of the monastery. The rationale most commonly offered is that the monastery, at the early stage of institutional development, lacked the wherewithal to provide members of the Sangha with the food that they needed. Surely the institutionalized monastery depicted in the Vinaya would not continue to demand of its monks that they search out for their own food patrons on the basis of their own charisma. However, as we'll see, narrative details emerge throughout the Vinaya which suggest that the institutional networks of the Sangha however, as we'll see, the narrative details emerge throughout the Vinaya, which suggest that the institutional networks of the Sangha were often insufficient to meet the needs of their monks. And in some Vinaya cases, it seems clear that the Sangha, or Buddhist order, had left its members with no institutional network to get food at all. I argue, against much of scholarly opinion on the subject, that it was precisely the lack of a comprehensive network of food distribution which continued to foster a culture of Pindapata, or begging for one's food, long after the process of institutionalization had begun. So the first section of the paper will introduce one of the principles by which I read these normative texts, such as the Vinaya, these legal codes, for anthropological data. And the second half will demonstrate the applicability of this approach to several different genres of narrative from the Buddhist legal tradition. First, we'll talk about how much of the data for ascetic practices, such as Pindapata, comes in the form of these legal narratives, precisely because so many conflicts arise between the householders, who are the patrons, who are supporting these monks, and the monastic clients during this process. You can imagine there's an enormous amount of confusion that happens when nobody knows whose responsibility it is to feed these people who are coming through the villages every day. Second, we'll discuss how these relations are strained further by the prospect of famine in the area where a particular monk or group of monks are begging. Finally, we'll discuss several instances in which legal narratives about sexual misconduct provide the backdrop for Pindapata practice. By employing an interpretive approach designed to extract this kind of anthropological data about the real life of these monks from these normative texts, we hope to exploit the Vinaya for evidence that ordinary monks engaged in Pindapata as a standard practice, not as something marginal. So in order to see what my approach brings to the study of so-called normative texts, we'll first look at the structure of a Vinaya narrative. So I'll read through the narrative just very briefly and then try to describe a little bit of what's going on here. It goes, if a monk enters a town to beg for food and passes by a brothel, and a prostitute grabs the monk, he should discipline his thoughts. When a monk is begging for food and there is a beautiful woman giving food to the monks, probably also meaning a prostitute here in this case, if the monk sees the woman and his desire is aroused, he should put down his bowl on the ground and order another person to deliver it to the woman. If a woman is giving food to the monk and she fills the bowl with one hand and holds the bowl on the bottom with the other, this is not dignified. And if lust is aroused to the extent that he touches her, it is a sanghavashesha, that is a offense, which requires a meeting of the order to see if he'll be dismissed or not. So what we have here in the yellow is what I'm calling the origin narrative. This is where a lot of the data comes from. And I'm juxtaposing this with what we typically think about law codes as the red here, which is the rule. Such and such a thing will happen, right? If the person does not act properly. It's this yellow bit in particular where we often find the most amount of data about the anthropology of the lives of these monks. In this legal case, the editors of the Vinaya begin with an origin narrative that sets the stage for the legal decision. These origin narratives can range in length from one line, as in this case, a monk passes by a brothel while begging, and they can go on for many pages. These origin narratives are typically followed by instructions for the monk on how best to improve his behavior, and often indicate a punishment which will occur if he does not. What it would seem is that there's a wealth of potential data to be mined from these texts, but many scholars have actually been quite skeptical, viewing these as unreflective of the lives of monks themselves. Scholars such as Gregory Chopin have argued that these texts reflect only the views of the people who wrote the Vinaya, and nothing about the life of the monks themselves. What I hope to show is the value of these texts not merely as a record of intentions of the people who wrote these texts, but as an anthropological record of the world these compilers lived in. In particular, we'll employ these texts to indicate the social realities of ascetic practice of Pindapata on the Indian subcontinent in the period in the early centuries CE, 0 to 500 or thereabouts. It's my contention that a careful examination, paying attention to these descriptive elements, not the normative elements, but the descriptive elements, will reveal that this practice of Pindapata was standard and central to early monastic communities. What I mean by standard or customary practice here is a behavior that these monastic authors, the people who wrote these codes, viewed as common enough and significant enough that they could mention the practices by the way or incidentally and expect their audience to be familiar with them. Jan Nattier, one of the most important recent commentators on early Indian Buddhism, focuses on this idea of the incidental mention of items unrelated to the primary agenda of the author in early Indian Buddhist scriptural material because she believes these elements provide valuable textual clues to the social realities behind the text. The origin narrative begins with a description of the de facto reality, that is, the situation which gives rise to the impropriety. It's the description of this de facto situation or practice in the origin narrative in which these incidental elements emerge. The narrative arc of a normative text is intended to present the reader with an ideologically consistent picture of the religious community. The elements incidental to the author's primary agenda are included precisely because they are presumed to be part of the world understandable to the reader or audience of the text. Given the likelihood that the incidental elements in a text reflect fragments, if not a comprehensive image of the social world the author views as obvious to the reader, we may assume that this evidence from the legal narrative will be particularly helpful in determining which monastic practices were viewed as standard by Vinaya authors. So, having discussed a little bit of the method, let's go to a couple of the cases here. So, any discussion of the ascetic practice of begging for one's sustenance in ancient India must address that most complex of relationships, that between the householder donor and the monastic client who receives the food from the householder. Contrary to the claims of many scholars in Indian Buddhism, the experience of begging for one's food was not a leisurely activity consisting of a mild stroll among the residents of the village who were somehow very eager to give away their produce, their most delicious food, that which was most valuable to them, to this random guy who was walking down the street. In her explanation of the religious logic informing the customs of giving in ancient India, Reiko Onuma suggests that householders believed that they would accrue merit for themselves and for their household if they made offerings only to a certain type of monk. And that monk is often talked about as the worthy recipient. This logic incentivizes giving only to a monk who matches a saintly type, a person who is viewed essentially as a saint. It also discourages not giving to monks who are viewed as having limited spiritual or moral capacity, which is to say, the ordinary monks, presumably at this time, the vast majority. So at this point, I'd like to just briefly introduce what I hope will be a helpful analogy to this idea of the worthy recipient, the monk who is worthy of receiving alms. So in the Western context, Peter Brown talks about the holiness of an individual as the reason why that person is worthy of receiving alms from lay patrons. He describes a transformation in late antiquity in which there's a shift from the locus of the supernatural, from the invisible gods of the oracle or the temple, to the bodies, the individual bodies of a limited number of exceptional human beings. These individuals possess a relationship with God that was personal to them, stable and clearly perceptible to their followers. This parallels the idea of the worthy recipient in the Indian world. The Latin term merita, meaning one's personal standing before God, overlaps significantly with the idea of punya or merit in the Indian Buddhist context. In the post-classical world, only those individuals whose merit was declared acceptable by their ordeal with the holy enjoyed greater intimacy with the supernatural. And it was by virtue of the excellent quality of their merit that these individuals came to be regarded as possessing the power to perform miracles, to heal, and to bless their fellow believers, both with salvation in the afterlife and with spiritual blessings in this life. And just as these exceptional human agents in the late antique West were capable of dispensing blessings to fellow believers by virtue of the holiness accrued to their person, the worthy recipient in the ancient Indian Buddhist tradition was capable of dispensing merit to those who made offerings to them. So the idea here is that if you aren't perceived as being worthy, you would not receive the food from those patrons. As we'll see in this next example here, the doctrine of the worthy beneficiary frames much of the discourse in Vinaya scenarios involving the practice of Pindapata. In the following case, a female householder, a female patron, makes a calculated decision to withhold offerings from a monk based on her own judgment of whether or not he is worthy. And the case runs as follows. The Buddha was in Shravasti, and the details are the same as the previous case. At that time, there was a monk begging for food. He put on his robes for entering the village, took his bowl, and entered town. While begging from door to door, he arrived at one house in particular. At that time, the husband said to his wife, "Offer this renouncer food." And the woman said, "What lineage does he belong to? Which religious school does he belong to?" she asked. "He is a monk of the Shakya lineage," which is to say, he is a Buddhist monk. And the woman said, "I will not give him food." And the husband asked, "Why not?" And she answered, "He is not a celibate practitioner. He is not a brahmachari. So I will not give him any." The monk said to the woman, "Sister, I am a brahmachari, and I am a celibate practitioner." In other words, I don't have a family, I don't have a sexual life. The woman said, "Even the Venerable Kalodayin, who is a famous Buddhist monk, is incapable of being celibate. He's incapable of these purity practices. How can you say of yourself, I am a brahmachari, I am a celibate practitioner?" The monk heard these terrible words, and the sorrow weighed heavily on his mind. He stopped begging for food and returned to the monastery and did not eat for the rest of the day. Now, further on in the episode, the monk is praised by the Buddha for his self-restraint in refusing to criticize Kalodayin, even if it's for the purpose of correcting this woman's image of the members of the Sangha, such as himself. The legal ruling at the end of this case, which we actually don't see here, is that monks should not speak ill of other monks in the Sangha, regardless of the perceived advantages. It's to these prescriptive conclusions appearing in the Vinaya that most scholars of this genre have turned their attention. The primary agenda, to employ Natier's terminology in this story, is to demonstrate, utilizing the character of the monk, the proper way to respond to accusations leveled at another monk. The narrative arc of this story bends toward the conclusion, which is a normative claim made by the jurists. Monks should not slander other monks. That's the rule. What I want to focus on here is not the prescription, what you should or should not do, but a description of how begging works in this case. Mention of begging here is not central to the purpose of this Vinaya case, but rather incidental to the author's primary agenda. According to Natier's hermeneutical approach, incidental elements make their way into narratives not as flashpoints for controversy, but innocuously, precisely because they are presumed to be familiar to the audience of the text. These narrative elements merely fill out a background narrative architecture the presumed audience of the monastic jurists will find culturally acceptable enough that they can accept whatever the legal judgment is. In other words, the description is presumed to be normal to the people who are reading it, part of daily life. When we examine the descriptions of this Pindapata beggar, several themes emerge and coalesce to provide a conception of the renouncer figure as living a life of indeterminacy with respect to how he gets his food. First, it's important to note this monk is abiding by the strictest standard of Pindapata practice, in that he is begging from door to door. This phrase indicates that he does not return to a particular family who feeds him every day. He doesn't know, therefore, what the quality or the quantity of food he's going to get is. The fact that he's unfamiliar with this family indicates he abides by the ascetic requirement that the ascetic monk not receive his meal at an appointed time or place, and therefore could not anticipate anything about what he would receive. The second narrative element indicates uncertainty about his next meal. This also indicates that he is an ordinary monk carrying out asceticism in the shadows. He is not a saint, and we know this because he's anonymous. He's unknown to us, the readers of the Vinaya, and unknown to his potential patrons. If he's a saint, people would be gathering around him, there would be parades, there would be a celebration. This person is anonymous to the donors. For practitioners, like this monk, anonymity often means that one has no reputation for spiritual virtue. In this case, the woman of the house is clear about her expectation that she gives only to renouncers who are reputed to be brahmacharins, or celibate practitioners. Without this reputation, one can only fall back on one's identity as a member of a particular renouncer order. Unfortunately, the woman of the house is judging this Buddhist monk begging at her door against the reputation of the other Buddhists which has reached her ears. She's basing her decision on rumors. According to this hearsay, the monk Kalodayin is representative of the best the Buddhists have to offer, and this for her is a poor standard indeed. This woman sees no value in making offerings to Buddhists, as they're incapable of celibacy, something a renouncer must be capable of if he is to be deemed worthy of offerings. It's not only this begging monk who is pigeonholed by virtue of his association with this monk Kalodayin in the mind of the woman. Theoretically, every other Buddhist monk who comes to her door, who doesn't have a reputation for virtue, will automatically be pigeonholed, and she will reject their request for food. A final remark I'd like to make on this passage is that it represents, in microcosm, a social reality for individual monks trying to beg their daily food amidst the fallout from broader ideological competition among all the different religious groups that would have existed in India at this time. The Buddhists were just one of many begging orders that would have been coming to the doors of patrons like these. The various renouncer orders in Indian society of the early centuries CE contended for pride of place in the court and in society at large. And these battles for status often determined whether or not a householder patronized a given individual at their door. It's clear from the incidental details which emerge in this narrative that our monk is a victim over these battles over reputation. So as we've just seen, the predilection of householders for making offerings to those monks on whom they would receive a return of a karmic investment holds potentially dire consequences for a monk who lacks spiritual credentials. If he doesn't look like a saint, why would you give him anything? The following case of a monk entering a village one morning in order to beg for food is illustrative of the uphill battle faced by Pindapata practitioners who did not possess a reputation for spiritual virtue. The case runs as follows. In the morning, a monk put on his robes for entering the village, took his bowl, and begged for food. And someone asked him, "Elder, do you possess the qualities of a holy man?" The monk did not proceed to praise himself. He then went from place to place begging for food, but did not get anything at all. As the day passed, his privation became overwhelming. He was starving and exhausted because of traveling from place to place looking for food. On the following occasion, though, he praised himself and immediately received food. As was the case in the previous example, the setting of the monk on his begging round is only peripherally related to the legal principle which concludes the narrative. The rule here is that monks may not advertise how great they are, how much their spiritual capacity influences who their person is. This monk is, of course, guilty of this offense, but regardless of the claim here, this origin narrative serves our purposes by further fleshing out an anthropological account of the Pindapata monk. As the monk sets out on his food round, he encounters what is likely a householder who asks whether or not he's obtained the qualities of a holy man. The passage does not indicate whether the monk has indeed achieved this vaunted status, which would make him a far more profitable investment from the point of view of a donor. But given that he initially attempts to abide by this imperative to avoid promoting himself, and his reputation, if he has been acknowledged as a saint elsewhere, does not precede him. And he appears to all before whom he appeals to be unworthy of offerings. Though the portrait we've painted of the predicament of this monk is grim enough, even if we stopped at this point in the narrative, the subsequent lines state that he went from place to place, begging for food and yet received nothing. So frustrated was the monk suffering without a reputation for the qualities of a saint, that he abandoned his hope that potential patrons were willing to serve an ordinary practitioner. The moment he began to talk up his virtues, he began receiving offerings. Lying, right, as it were. In this episode, the incidental details in this narrative coalesce to form an image of a monk, observing at first the rigorous interpretation of Pindapata, which requires that the source of the practitioner's food be indeterminate. First, the monk is not heading to the houses of those he expects will provide for him. No rich patron for this guy. He is moving from place to place randomly. And second, being an ordinary monk and not a saint, he is unable to bestow any karmic rewards, any blessings to these patrons, and therefore supporters are in short supply. Now, the cases we examined in this previous section here, up until now, convey the sense that the Buddhist monk begging for food would have faced a plethora of prejudices, making the process of getting enough to eat a potentially exhausting chore. It would not be a stretch to expect, therefore, that if navigating these prejudices was difficult for monks in times of plenty, then periods of famine would have magnified their challenges. And yet scholars who approach the question of how the Buddhist Sangha fed itself from a macro-sociological perspective suggest that famines were not a major problem in the lives of monks. However, these macro-sociological claims do run counter to a considerable body of data in the Vinaya, which attests to the ongoing problem of food shortages and to their serious consequences for monks who are supposed to be engaged in Pindapata asceticism. Here we focus on a legal narrative which provides the rationale for the fourth major Buddhist offense against praising oneself falsely. This iconic Vinaya story includes a variety of fascinating narrative elements which argue powerfully that the trope of the monk living in regions facing food shortages was not a mere fiction, but a well-accepted social reality to those who composed the text. This episode begins with a group of monks practicing Pindapata in a locale subject to food shortages. They enter the city to beg for leftovers. Leftovers is a common thing. You would not typically get a great meal, but whatever was left over from breakfast. And we have to think that a lot of the food that was being received was rotten, right? So truly an unappetizing experience for your one meal of the day. These leftovers. The Buddha advises these monks to rely upon those who will host them during the rains retreat, telling them to remain where they are and not to endure starvation and hardship. The monks in this group dispersed to regions with populations which may have been better equipped or more willing to support them. While the official sanction of Vinaya jurists was given to monks to seek out locales more likely to feed members of the Buddhist Sangha, one of the groups in this episode went a step further to avoid the possibility of starvation, concocting a plan to ensure that villagers would support them. And the story goes like this. The Buddha was in Vaishali, and at that time there was a famine and it was very difficult to obtain food. A group of monks entered the city to beg for leftovers, but got nothing at all. At that time, the Buddha told the group of monks, you should rely on each other, rely upon your own supporters and spend the rains retreat with them. You should not stay here and endure the hardships of famine. The monks followed this order. There were some who headed to Magadha, others who headed to Vagamuda, and there were others who went to the riverside of a particular town and gathered and talked among themselves. And they said to each other, it's difficult to obtain food by begging in these times, but there are people in this village who will definitely provide for us. We will praise one another, saying, such and such a person has attained this saintly advantage. Such and such a person has attained this saintly advantage, and so on for the entire group. Mutual praise for having achieved very high levels of a saintly status. So the monks enter the village, and they go on to praise themselves. Hearing this, the householders experience a feeling of great joy and say that they have obtained excellent benefit on account of hosting these holy men. After praising themselves to one another, the householders, having heard this, thought how rare it was and exclaimed that this had never happened before. They decreased the rations for themselves and did not again perform rituals for other groups of ascetics. They cut off support for other people, and they added it to the offerings of the monks. So they actually deprived their families and other members of their community for food in order to support these monks who were supposed holy men. Now, the plan initiated by this group of monks involved first selecting a village in which there were sympathetic religionists, presumably Buddhist in orientation. Next, this group of monks headed for the wealthiest homes at which they made their appeal. The monks then proceeded according to their plan of mutual praise, which involved a declaration of spiritual attainments of the various members of their party. Upon hearing that this group of holy men would be staying in the village during the months of the rains retreat, the householders, as anticipated by the plotting monks, thought how rare this was and exclaimed this had never happened before. Now, this passage is striking because the calculus of the monks, as they create strategies to ensure they are fed, further reinforces our claim, demonstrated above, that the general cultural proclivity in ancient India was for patrons of religious figures to evaluate the spiritual qualities of those to whom they would make donations. So convinced are the householders of the great spiritual capacity of these monks that they vow to decrease the amount of food set aside for themselves, refuse to make donations to others, and abandon other ritual strategies. Presumably, these householders have been convinced that they can generate more merit by simply making offerings to the Buddhist monks now that they know that they are holy men. The second, this passage is representative of an important narrative thread in the Vinaya, in that it demonstrates the presence of a regulatory regime for monks who face starvation in times of famine. Although the focus of Vinaya jurists is on expressing their disapprobation for monks engaged in self-promotion, the narrative first makes allusion to guidelines from the Buddha that they need not remain in a region in which they will not be fed, but may spend the rainy season elsewhere. In other words, there's a game plan for dealing with privation. Finally, the guidelines about famine specifically and the narrative elements from this episode in toto testify to the anxieties of Buddhist monks operating in the ancient Indian context, who cannot rely upon centralized or routinized monastic distribution networks. They're on their own. The monks in this case are reliant upon the custom of pindapata. As a consequence, they face the dangers of hunger, malnutrition, and potentially starvation. In this case, the resourcefulness of these monks led them to behaviors that are condemned, of course, by the monastic jurists, by the authors of the Vinaya. Of course, the chicanery of these monks, that these monks ultimately resort to, flies in the face of the spirit of pindapata. However, the depths of their transgression should not be thought of solely as a personal moral failing, but should be regarded as a reflection of the potentially desperate straits that monks found themselves in when famine struck. Now, the last two cases we'll be examining belong to a genre of narratives in the Vinaya in which the practitioner ends up committing sexual misdeeds in the course of his begging round. Anxiety about sexual temptation is a theme that is constant across the texts of the Buddhist tradition. This danger is amplified when a monk exits the confines of the hermitage or monastery in which he resides, because his thoughts and behavior cannot be effectively policed by monastic authorities. The Buddhist conception of the body, and consideration is typically limited to the male body in the Vinaya, is of a sensorium of desires, which is easily susceptible to stimulation from without. The anxieties about sexual temptation among members of the monastic community are given voice in many Vinaya cases in which the monk enters into private or semi-private relationships with female householders in the course of his begging round. These episodes are useful for our purposes in that they betray a widespread concern on the part of the authorities of the Sangha for the dangers of sexual temptation faced by monks while practicing pindapata. The body of legal cases in the Vinaya, which take up the matter of sexual improprieties perpetrated by these monks, is thus a vital resource for the study of the begging round, in that these episodes addressing lascivious behavior also testify that the practice of Pindapata was standard in early Buddhism. In the passage we discussed above, in which the monk is tempted by, in earlier passages in the Vinaya that I'm not going to show here, monks are often tempted by the lascivious women. And it's the contact that they have, the physical contact that they have with these women that ignite these fires of lust. However, their contact is limited provided that they have disinfectant of other monks surrounding them, other monks accompanying them on their journey. Sexual desires will not be fulfilled. There will be no danger of temptation, provided that there is the vital disinfectant of a third party present. This following case exemplifies the dangers posed by the unsupervised contact with the householder woman in the course of the food round. At that time, the Buddha was in Shravasti. There was a monk begging for food who was young, and therefore there was a lot he did not understand. He did not look to see whether it was proper to enter a house before entering. There was a woman asleep in the house. That woman was naked and lying face up, and impurities were issuing from the female organ. The monk was ashamed when he saw this, and he quickly left the house. As the monk was going out, a woman's husband entered the house, and he saw the wife lying naked on her back, her body defiled with impurity. Seeing this, he thought to himself, "My wife is lying on her back, defiled with impurity." The monk quickly ran out of the house. And this person must certainly have committed an offense against my wife. The husband pursued him and then questioned him, asking, "Are you running away after having committed an offense against my wife?" The monk said, "Oh, householder, say no such thing. We are not permitted to do such things." The householder then said, "You left my house. How can you say you did not do it?" He then beat the monk until he was almost dead. Now, the legal principle monastic jurists set down at the conclusion of this case is that monks must use extreme caution in calling upon householders in order to avoid offenses which come with the invasion of a family's private life. In this case, the monk is alone, as most of the monks we've seen before have been. In his naivete, this monk does not check with the resident that the resident is prepared for his visit, but simply barges into the house. We know that this monk is engaged in the practice of begging in random order from house to house and not allowing himself to return to familiar and supportive patrons because he is neither expected by this female resident nor is he aware of what he will find when he arrives. The manner in which the monk in this case committed this egregious sexual impropriety is a direct consequence of the fact that he was practicing the strictest level of Pindapata. Now, our goal in this paper was to review several cases which I take to be representative of a broader body of evidence in the Vinaya, suggesting that the practice of Pindapata was regarded as a standard lifestyle. I've demonstrated that narrative details incidental to the normative claims, which is to say the primary agenda of Vinaya compilers, provide the building blocks for anthropology of the begging practices of the ascetic practitioner. In our discussion of the several Vinaya cases above, we sought to demonstrate that the manner in which these monks acquired food was highly indeterminate. This indeterminacy was indicated by the evidence that these monks wandered from house to house in random order, rather than returning to the homes of those who were familiar and reliable donors. The threat of indeterminacy was strengthened in those episodes in which it became clear that the doctrine of the worthy beneficiary disqualified ordinary, read here non-saintly monks, from receiving alms. The purpose of this admittedly skeletal anthropology of this strict Pindapata ascetic is not insignificant because it challenges scholarly conceptions of the ascetic as a marginal, if not invisible, figure in the early Indian Buddhist monastic institution. This method of looking at the Vinaya is something which people have rarely done, and I hope that it's some minor encouragement to look at these codes as strong evidence for social realities behind the Buddhist textual tradition. Thanks very much. So I guess it's time for questions.
Thank you so much. This was really interesting. I really appreciate the close reading of these texts. And I'm not an India specialist. I'm a Japan specialist. So one of my first questions is, what are the other sources for this time period? And how do those, it seems like you're bringing up a new way to look at the and this period. I'm wondering what other sources are available for the period and how those interact with your argument.
Right, so there's sutra materials, the Lotus Sutra, the Diamond Sutra, a lot of these sutras which have been translated many, many times. There's also a host of other sutra material which has never been translated, the vast majority of it. That's the kind of material that people have actually been focusing on, especially because people in Indian Buddhism have been following Japanese Buddhist scholars for a long time. Japanese scholars of Buddhist studies for a long time. Looking at the Vinaya is a fairly recent thing to do, and actually taking on the Vinaya as a narrative text, which is not merely normative, and looking at this is in some ways a kind of response to or reaction against looking specifically at sutra material. However, sutra material is an important resource because it can confirm a lot of the details that appear in these cases. The problem with that is they're often heavily laden with a rhetoric which obscures some of the social realities, which are a lot clearer in Vinaya sources. So sutra material can be an important companion, and the sutras that are most common are things like the Lotus Sutra, the Diamond Sutras, the Rashtrapala, and so on. And then the host of sutras which have been untranslated. In general, I use them secondarily, but there is confirmation there. There's also commentaries on the Vinaya, commentaries that exist in Indic languages, but also commentaries that exist in Chinese. The majority, I would say, actually are preserved in Chinese. And these materials are really helpful for working back and looking at elements, amplifying certain elements in the Vinaya which remain underexplored, or if you have a given social practice that appears in 3 lines in the Vinaya, you may get a commentary that comes 300, 400, or 500 years later, which will tell you a lot more about what was going on, even if there's some slippage as a result of time. So those are just some of the sources that I use in addition to the Vinaya. But using the Vinaya is, we're talking about a tiny fraction of people who even look at the texts at all. So I'm trying to move in this direction and pull people away from pure sutra readings.
Just one little follow-up question then. Is the Vinaya you keep referring to as law cases, are they representing actual cases or rather abstract ideals of law cases?
Right. So there are people who have argued that they are just literature. They have no historical value whatsoever, or if they do, they're so peripheral that they almost don't matter for that purpose. And most people who have looked at them have actually said, we are doing literary studies, nothing else. To my mind, though, this idea of there are several people who are looking at biblical criticism for people who do biblical criticism in order to extract historical fragments from Western texts, have came up with a bunch of different hermeneutical tools. One of them is this idea of incidental mention. When something is the most simple way example that I've heard is the way in which a person enters a monastery door, the way the door jamb is, the direction in which you have to pull the door. It's hard to argue that that's a mere abstraction. It's probably reflective of an historical reality that is, maybe it's not 150, but it's 200 or 250 CE. So working from that hermeneutical principle of incidental mention, you can get too abstract and then it becomes less useful method. But in general, I think if you stay close to the ground and the practices of the everyday, then I think that this is a method which is pretty successful and almost never used, either in this source material or in Indian Buddhist texts in general. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, so I'm not really sure. You keep saying that no one's used this technique. I feel like Gregory Chopin and Shane Clark have done sort of a lot of this with the same materials, right? So I actually see what you're doing as following in that very venerable tradition in Buddhist studies. So I think that's a good thing. So don't say no one's done this before. Say, hey, I'm following that. And I like the thrust of what you're trying to do, to sort of dig deeper and sort of uncover these other realities. I like your idea of literary anthropology. And the Vinaya is a perfect source for this, right? Because it's prescriptive, right, and therefore it raises all these questions. So I think, that's great. I have a significant critique, though, is just with how you framed your talk today about, asceticism on the one hand or the middle way on the other. I certainly take your point that the Buddhism that we're talking about here is more ascetic and more difficult than people today like to think, right? You said, people talk about Zen meditation for business success. And the sort of modern idea we have is, yes, Buddhism is supposed to make you feel good and so on. And that is clearly nonsense and not true. But if we go back to the time period, this absolutely was a middle way between the life of a householder on the one hand and the sort of more extreme Hindu sort of ascetics who didn't eat regular food at all on the other hand. So you were sort of saying that this is a religion of asceticism, not the middle way. And actually, I think it's both. It's an asceticism of the middle way. Mm-hmm. You're not living at home in a nice, comfortable house, sleeping on a bed, but you're not like those Indian ascetics who eat 1 grain of rice per day and never wash themselves, or only eat food that they find on the ground, for example. So if we consider this in terms of the broader ascetic spectrum, it's a middle way asceticism, whereas you were sort of framing it as either or. Anyway, that's it. We can talk about it more.
No, I appreciate that, and I mean, it's a complex thing to try to bring a term which is laden with so much history, but in the West and in the Indian context or elsewhere. I think the reason, to address your first point, Chopin and Clark, part of the problem with Gregory Chopin is that he refuses to call what he's doing history. This is extremely confusing for undergrads. It's extremely confusing for grad students. And in fact, when I've done my own personal surveys of people who are in the field, who are experts, who don't really know what he's doing. And I think that hedging in the way that he's done, I think that's what it is, because he doesn't want to be accused of doing bad history. And this is, by the standards of classic archival history, he is doing bad history. And so I can see why he's concerned about it. But I think what he's done in the way that he's positioned himself in the field is deeply problematic and extremely misleading. And so what, to my mind, better to say, we're doing history here. Of course, acknowledging the contributions that he's had in terms of his readings of the text, to call them something very general, because he doesn't call them anything in particular methodologically. Acknowledging the value of what he's done, and certainly I've read all of his stuff and I've been influenced by him, but he doesn't use the word history. And I think it's important to say what we're doing methodologically, and it's also, if we're going to do so and call something history and call it, and it is something quite different from classic archival history, let's say it's history, but I'm defining it slightly differently. So to me, it's not a small thing to be clear about method. And to that extent, I think I would say he has not done it. Shane Clark, I think, comes closer to that, but still, he's very much a student of Chopin in that sense. And I think trying to be careful, to be a charitable reader, in trying to be careful, you end up with essentially a literary study in terms of the way they describe their work. Shane Clark less so, but that's certainly Gregory Chopin. So that's, I think, where... And there may be people who say, well, it's just a technicality, whatever you call it, it's the same thing. But to me, labeling it very clearly really helps for developing method and being consistent, and then allowing the critique to come in. So, but we can further discuss that if you like.
I haven't read Chopin in years, so I haven't really looked at it this closely. But the impression that I get, remembering back to reading his work, is well, he's exposing these realities, whether he wants to say that he's doing that or not. And I feel like the effect of what you're doing is similar to the effect of what he's done, even though you may be approaching it in very different terms.
I think you're right. And what I would have hoped for is that he would define clearly that that's what he was doing. But there are times where he actually says what he's doing is a literary study. There's other times where he uses words like history, but then he says, I'm not really doing that. And so when you read sort of his full corpus, you're left feeling, I think, methodologically adrift. And so that's where the criticism stems from. But you're absolutely correct that I've been influenced by him. Lots of people have been influenced by him. And the kind of suspicious readings, I think is probably the best way to put it, that he's put forward, I think are everybody's benefited from. So to that extent, there is continuity between what he's doing and what I'm doing. Sorry, was this second question?
So I'm critiquing you're saying this is asceticism, not the middle way. Right. And I'm saying it's an asceticism of the middle way.
Right. So yes. Yes. So this is a good point. And again, theoretically, you could define asceticism however you want. There are people who define it in the Western tradition. It's a Western word, right? It comes from the Greek context. Training for the Olympics, right? Very different from Christian martyrdom, but it appears in both contexts, just in the Greek, right? But in the reason why I want to get away from this idea that Buddhism is the middle way is that the body suffers an enormous amount in the early Indian Buddhist monastery. Not always because the monk is so excited about torturing himself or something like that. In fact, I would never use words like self-torture or self-flagellation, these type of terms which are much more belong to the medieval Christian context. But the body is being made to suffer. Privation is extremely important. Privation that leads just in the context of the begging round. I mean, there were monks who complained in the Vinaya about eating rotten food every day. In the hot Indian sun, the food that's been sitting around for 4 or 5 hours, and you eat that every day. That's a horrible way to live. You could even complain about it every day, and they do. Sometimes they mischievously try to get fresher food. But just in the context of the begging round, I think we're talking about, one meal a day. The meal is often rotten or leftovers with no spices, no flavor. It has almost no nutritional content. It's truly a terrible existence, I think. And I would say that there are many other groups, let's leave the Jains aside for a moment, who practice asceticism. They call it tapas or dutta or whatever, which is actually more benevolent. For example, the Brahmanical brahmacharya, the Brahmanical student, is able to eat more often than the Buddhist monk. So just in terms of this practice, the Buddhists actually skew pretty far to that more extreme part of the spectrum. The only ones who are maybe perhaps a little bit more extreme are the Jains. And then the other point I would make is that this is just one practice. The Dutta Gunas include practices such as Pamchakulika, which is making your robes from fragments of cloth that are found in cemeteries and rubbish piles. This, I think, is on par with much of the more rigorous asceticism of the Indian world. And so if I go down the list sort of systematically, you find the Buddhists performing quite rigorous forms of, I think, what we would feel comfortable calling asceticism. But.
Because sure, maybe you're wearing scraps, but you're not going to make it. So again, Buddhism is always finding a middle way between the ascetic extremes.
Yeah, well, it's a really good point, but perhaps if there are any other questions.